morning. Well, as Dan said, it's my privilege to do the next one in the series on unintended heroes, and I've loved the last two. I thought that Rob, when he did Samson, and Steffi on Deborah did a fantastic job, and I really enjoyed those. If you didn't see them, it's well worth going back. So a hero then is somebody who does amazing exploits, somebody who we may be looking to aspire to be like or to emulate. And sometimes we get local heroes, don't we? People that are just doing good things day in, day out, just doing the right thing, being consistent, and they can be heroes too. And I don't know about you, but we've all probably got a list of heroes. For me, I would say Christine Kane, who had the courage to set up A21 and take on human trafficking head on. Bobby Houston, co-pastor of Hillsong Network, who I love because she just seems so authentic and just is herself and releases all of us to be ourselves and bring what we have to contribute. Also, I love the fact that she seems so faithful with just whispers from God, and it's incredible what if you're faithful with a whisper from God, what that can turn into. Just absolutely astonishing. Priscilla Shirer, I would say, is my favourite preacher. I also love Queenie from Blackadder and Meryl Streep in Devil Wears Prada, of course. So I'll leave it to you to figure out which ones I'm trying to emulate the most and trying to be like. But seriously, in terms of Bible characters, I think Esther would be one of my favourites, and that's who we're going to look at this morning. The book of Esther tells the story of the Feast of Purim, which is celebrated by Jews every year and is a celebration of God's deliverance of his people. It's possibly a familiar story to many of us, but I think it really has some things to speak to us about, which would be very relevant for the point in time we're in right now. It's famously the only book of the Bible where God is never mentioned, and yet it really is a story of God's providence. You can see his fingerprints all over it, and just amazing kind of coincidences, if you like, happening the whole way through the book, showing that God really is in control. And yet there's human involvement as well, and individual responsibility required. And this is often one of those tensions that we wrestle with, isn't it? Where we know the Bible says that God is in heaven, he does whatever he pleases. He literally has the whole world in his hands. And yet he seems to want us to work with him and do things for him as if he needed that. And sometimes the results do seem to be tied very much to our faithfulness in carrying out what he requires of us. And so it's one of those things that is a tension and a mystery a little bit, but this story seems to address that very well. It's also a story of extraordinary courage, and it's got some quite ironic, sort of almost comedy sort of twists in it, which I hope you'll enjoy. So I'm going to do the whole story. There's about 10 chapters, so I'll be paraphrasing it all fairly swiftly and just pulling out a few things as we go through. For any of you that want to watch the Esther movies, there are a few of them, and I watched them all, and they were quite good actually, except for many of the details weren't correct, I didn't think, which my family will tell you always winds me up. If it's going to be a historical movie, then it should be true to the facts, I think. But anyway, let's get on. So the story is set around 486 in Susa, which was one of the capitals of the Persian Empire during the reign of King Xerxes. Towards the end of the Old Testament, the children of Israel got worse and worse behaved, turned to other gods. Eventually, just being chastised by invading armies wasn't enough to pull them into line. And so God did promise that they'd be exiled to foreign lands. And Israel went off to Assyria, Judah then to Babylon. I'm sure you remember the story of Daniel and his buddies when they got exiled as young men to Babylon. And then Persia replaced Babylon as the ruling power, and their land stretched the whole way from Ethiopia, or Kush as it was called, to India. So it's a vast, vast empire, a massive empire, the whole of the Middle East as we would think of it. And some of the Jews had actually, by the point in our story, had gone back to Jerusalem, but many remained in the places they were exiled to and did, work and lived good lives there. So we begin with the mighty King Xerxes holding a banquet for all the nobles and people of his lands for 180 days. Can you imagine? And this was just to show his wealth and his power and his vast empire. And then he ends up with a 7-day banquet for the people of just the city of Susa, where the palace was. And we're given details about gold and silver couches and pavements of mother of pearl and precious stones, and wine being served in goblets of gold, with a king's decree that everyone should drink as much as he wanted. So at the end of this time, when the king was in high spirits, unsurprisingly, from drinking for that long, he ordered 7 servants to go and fetch Queen Vashti, his queen, so that he could show off her beauty to everyone. Now you can imagine they're all all the guys probably loud and drunk, and we don't know whether she was even allowed to be clothed or how she was going to be paraded in front of them, but she refused, as many of us might have done. However, this vast show of wealth and power came crashing down around his ears as his own wife wouldn't even do what he said. So the king was enraged. He went to his advisors to come up with a plan, and they decided that they would depose Queen Vashti. They would never allow her to come into the king's presence again. And they've written this into the law of the Medes and the Persians, which we're always told can never be repealed. It's kind of written in stone, can't be gone back on. And the reason they gave was that if women all around the empire got to hear of this, then they would disobey their own husbands, and they couldn't have that. So she was deposed, and they came up with an idea to run some kind of beauty contest where the servants would go out all over the empire and get beautiful young virgins to come into the palace so that the king would pick whichever one he liked the most as his queen. So obviously, he thought this was a great idea. And at this point, we're introduced to Queen Esther. She's a young Jewish woman, beautiful, we're told, and she's an orphan brought up by her uncle Mordecai. We often gloss over this. I think any of us that have heard this story before, you think, oh, it's a great opportunity, really, getting to go into the palace. But can you imagine what it was like? All these young girls being rounded up and brought into the harem, brought into the palace for the king to use them however he wanted. And, you know, I've said that one of my heroes is Christine Kane, fighting against human trafficking. And really, this wouldn't have been that much different, to be honest. And one of the movies does capture this very well. So Esther was brought into the king's harem, given to Hegai, who was one of the eunuchs, one of the servants, and he was the one in charge. And the first thing we see is that she pleased him and she won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with beauty treatments, with special food, assigned her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace, and moved her and her attendants to the best place in the harem. And we see favor recurring a lot in this story. And many times when we experience favor, it's really a sign that God is at work in our lives. We get his undeserved favor and ease on our lives, and we know that that is him blessing us, but also it can be him steering a course for our lives, and it's a good principle actually to follow our favor. But this can be quite passive, and we also need to work with our favor. We see that Esther won his favor, this servant who was in charge. So every girl had to have 12 months of beauty treatment, 6 months of oils, 6 months of perfumes and cosmetics. Sounds like the ultimate spa, but just keep in mind that each one of these girls was going to end up having a night with the king, and he would decide whether he wanted to keep her or not. And so it really was pretty grim. When Esther's turn came, again, she followed advice, she showed wisdom, she showed humility, and she won favor. We see this again and again. She wins people's favor. In chapter 2, it says, now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet to celebrate. We then learn that Mordecai, her uncle, uncovers a plot. He finds out that 2 of the guards who guard the king's palace are conspiring to assassinate King Xerxes. So at this point in time, Esther has the ear of the king. She's been not just appointed as his queen. So Mordecai gets a message to her to uncover this plot and expose it and tell the king, which she does. The two officials are then found and taken care of by impaling them on poles, which is what they used to do back then. And this story was recorded in the king's annals, like the historical records of the reign. And that's significant. We'll come back to that. Next, in chapter 3, we're introduced to Haman. He's the villain of the piece, and we are told that he's just been honored by the king and is like second in the empire, like the prime minister kind of thing. So everybody has to bow down and acknowledge him and honor him. We're also told that he is an Agagite, which means that he's a descendant of the Amalekites, which, if you go way back in Jewish history, King Saul fought them and beat them really badly in battle. So the king has recently honored this chap. Everyone has to bow down, but Mordecai refused. We don't quite know why. We know, and they know, that Mordecai's a Jew at this point, which is curious because he told Esther, don't tell anybody about your heritage. Don't tell anybody that you're a Jew. But we know that he's a Jew. And Haman is really angry at the lack of respect. He seems to be carrying a grudge, possibly because of all the history, the fact the Amalekites were beaten. And he's looking for a way not just to get rid of Haman, to get rid of Mordecai, but to eradicate all the Jews from the land. And they have this dramatic ceremony where they decide to cast lots, or cast the pur. That's where Purim comes from, to see which day this would happen. And I think this is the first mistake that he makes. In Proverbs, it says Yahweh controls the lot, and they've handed it over, put the lot in the hands of the gods to find out what day this will happen, and our God is working. Then Haman goes to the king. As an interesting ploy, when people are going to lie, they often will mix it with truth, and it's much more effective. He says a true statement: there are different people living in this land. Then he says their customs are different, which is true, but who cares, kind of thing. And then he says an outright lie: they don't obey the king's commands. So then he's getting the king interested. And then he says, let's destroy them, and I'll give you 10,000 talents of silver. This is what Haman's saying to the king. The king doesn't want the money, but he hands over the signet ring and allows Haman to do whatever he wants. So dispatches were sent throughout the land, throughout this vast empire, to say on this particular day, it was a good number of months, I think almost a year in advance, on that day, all of the Jews, men, women, and children, can be destroyed and their property seized. So this has gone out, this is decreed, this is written into the law of the Medes and the Persians. This is going to happen. And the king and Haman sit down to drink that night. And it says that the city of Susa is bewildered. This has sort of come from nowhere. You get that impression. And nobody really understands. Mordecai, Esther's uncle, learns about this plot and goes into mourning, which would have been a very loud demonstration of weeping and wailing in the streets, putting on sackcloth and ashes, and many of them followed and wept and wailed. So Esther sent clothes for him to make himself respectable and dress up again, but he refused them. So the eunuchs were going backwards and forwards, trying to find out what was going on. Mordecai told them everything that was planned about this day when all the Jews were going to be destroyed, and asked that Esther go and beg the king that this shouldn't happen. She sent back this message, and this would be the very, she sent back this message from chapter 4, that any man or woman, she would think, everybody knows this, if you approach the king without his permission, you will be put to death. That is the law, unless he extends the gold scepter to you. That's the only way it would happen, and your lives would be spared. But she says 30 days have passed and I haven't seen the king. So she's maybe thinking that she's out of favor at this point. She hasn't seen him. When Esther's words went back to Mordecai, he sent this answer, which I think is the famous bit in the whole book of Esther that we all know. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, Relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? It's amazing, isn't it? God's been at work. God has clearly orchestrated. What were the chances that she would be chosen, of thousands possibly of girls from their empire? She's been chosen. She's been favored. She's got the ear of the king despite his many advisors. God has pulled all this together, but now it's her turn. And at this point, she has a part to play. It marks a kind of turning point in the story. Esther clearly recognizes this is a massive decision and is willing to take the risk. And I just wonder what went through her mind at this point as she decided, should she go to the king or not? Then the tables turn. She gathers up all of her courage and wisdom, and she says to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who were in Susa, fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. I and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I'll go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. It's incredible courage, isn't it? That's the bit I love about this story. I just love that she is prepared. She knows that she is there for such a time as this, and she's prepared to lay her life down if that's what it takes. And I just want us to ponder just for a moment, just to kind of think with me, what time is it we're in? I've been thinking a lot about this. For such a time as this, what is this? What time is this that we are in? Where are you? What's God saying to you right now? What's he saying to me? And what are we doing about it? And can you identify, perhaps, I know I've been very challenged with the kind of passive living in the good of God's blessing and knowing that all things will work together for good, particularly in this time of uncertainty. It's very easy to kind of sit back and think, well, God will work all things for his good. We know he will, but actually, is he asking us to do something? It's very easy to live in the favor of God, isn't it? I know I appreciate the amount that God blesses me and I live in his favor. Sometimes he even answers my prayers when I haven't even bothered to speak them out to him. Have you ever had that? And it's very easy just to be passive. But maybe it's time to take action. Maybe it's time to work with the favor that God has given us. Maybe God's put you in that workplace for such a time as this. Maybe it looks very different right now. I mean, it's a weird kind of thing to think, but God isn't surprised that COVID is rampaging the earth. He knew that it would. And that's not to say don't pray for it to end, don't pray for protection. We need to do those things, all those good things. But there are opportunities in it too. And for many of us, it's given us a time to reflect and refocus. For many of us, our world, our circle of contacts looks very different. The opportunities we have look very different, but God has us there for such a time as this. So, to chapter 5. If you're following me, I'm up to chapter 5 now. Esther goes to the king. She stands in her royal robes, and we're told that he's pleased with her. So that must have been a massive relief. She's in favor, and he says, he puts out the golden scepter and says, Queen Esther, come, what's your request? I'll give you up to half the kingdom. So she's in favor, but what a relief. What a scary moment, not knowing exactly how you were going to be greeted. He was unpredictable, this king. He would execute people on a whim, and she had to go and break the law and stand in front of him. And it just occurred to me that many of us might feel uncertainty approaching God. We're told that we're not just coming to a powerful king, but the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But we're told as his children, if you know him today, you're told that you can come boldly, approach the throne of grace to receive help in your time of need. And there's no uncertainty. There's nothing to fear for us. Jesus has taken our punishment, made that way clear on the cross so that we can stand before him, holy, righteous, having the right to stand in front of this God and bring him our requests. We're children of God. We're favored. We're accepted. It's incredible, isn't it? And I'd say if you tuned in and you don't know Jesus this morning, if you don't have a relationship, maybe you think that he is a bit scary. Maybe you think he wouldn't like you just because that's what God's like, or maybe because of things you've done. And I just want to tell you that his scepter is always extended towards you. His arms are always open towards you. He would love nothing more than to get into a relationship with you, this morning. And the Bible says that if we recognize that we've lived for ourselves and lived in a way that's contrary to what God will want for us, we can do a 180 degrees turn, commit the rest of our life to serving him and knowing him and following him. And you can do that this morning. And if you would want to do that, we would love to be able to pray for you. And we'll give you details of how you can do that at the end this morning. Or if you're with somebody, just ask them to pray with you. That would be amazing. So Esther's request, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet that she was going to prepare. So they loved to accept this request, this invitation. Obviously, they loved eating and drinking by the looks of it. And so when they went to the banquet, he said, what's your request? I'll give you up to half the kingdom. And she said, I want you to come to another banquet the next day. So you kind of think that she seems to be stalling for time here. I don't know why she just didn't ask. But anyway, she's kind of, the tension is building up. So Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But then he saw Mordecai at the gate who didn't bow down to him, and he got really angry again. So he went home, he bragged to his family about only me and the king were invited to this banquet, just how important I am. But this man Mordecai still won't bow down to me, and he was annoyed and angry. His wife and friends kind of hassled him to start doing something about that, and they suggested that he put a pole in his garden where Mordecai could be impaled on it, which he thinks is a great idea. And obviously the king seems to be doing whatever he wants. So he was going to go to the king that very next day and put this to him. Now the pace picks up a little bit. We start to get carried along by events now. That very night, the king couldn't sleep. So he's pacing around. He asks for the annals of the kingdom to be brought to him and read. I presume to bore him to sleep. I don't know why he wanted those read to him. But he heard this story of a while ago when Mordecai uncovered the plot. And he said, what was done to honor this man? So they said nothing had been done. He hadn't been recognized at all. So incredibly ironically, the next morning, Haman gets up. He thinks, I'm going to the king. I've had this pole built. I'm going to get Mordecai impaled. I'm going to sort it out. And the king gets in first and says, now, what should be done to the man that the king wants to honor? So Haman, being very arrogant, thinks, well, it's bound to be me. So he says, well, what you should do is you should get a horse that the king's ridden, get robes that the king has worn, and a crest on the horse, and get this man paraded through the streets, shouting and declaring, this is what will be done to the man that the king delights to honor. So the king says, so go to Mordecai the Jew at the king's gate and do all these things for him and don't leave out anything, none of the details that you've said. Go and do that. It was brilliant. So can you imagine how angry and humiliated he is as he has to lead the horse through the street declaring, this is what will be done for the man the king delights to honor. So he's so angry, so humiliated and embarrassed. He goes back to his family, speaks to his wife and his advisors. And this is where the first check comes. They say to him, you might want to reconsider, basically. They're saying, Mordecai's been honored by the king now, and he's a Jew, and you're looking to wipe out all the Jews. You might come to ruin. They're really kind of giving him a check to slow down. But at that point, the eunuchs, the servants arrive to carry him off to this second banquet that Esther has invited him to. So he's getting carried along by the pace. No time to think, no time to reconsider. And the king says, Esther, what is your request? So she says, if I found favor with you, your majesty, if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed and annihilated. If we'd only been sold into slavery, I wouldn't have even bothered you with it. So the king says, who is this? Who would do this thing? And she pointed to Haman. It's Haman, it's him, this vile Haman, she says. The king goes out in a rage. I guess that he normally asks Haman to sort everything for him and asks his advice, but he can't do that. So he's going out to consider what will he do. And Haman is left to plead for his life with Queen Esther. In his distress, he falls on her. And just as the king comes back in, he's on top of her, looking like he's either molesting her or attacking her. And the king flies into a rage. The eunuch that's standing there helpfully steps forward and says, actually, there's a pole that Mordecai has, that Haman has had built in his garden to impale Mordecai on. Perhaps we should put him on that. And that's what happens. So you couldn't make it up, could you? So many twists and turns and everything just happening in this story. And he's impaled on this pole that he has set up for his own enemy. It's incredible. The estate of Haman was then given to Esther, and the signet ring given to Mordecai, and he then is made second in the land. But the Queen Esther goes back to the king as well and just says, look, the law of the Medes and Persians can't be repealed, and there's still this date when all the Jews are going to be annihilated. So she's pleading for mercy, and the king asks them to set it up so that the Jews can fight back and fight for their freedom. And they do this, and we're told that they're victorious. So it's amazing that sometimes these sort of tough things happen. You know, you sort of think, why couldn't it be stopped? But sometimes really tough things do happen to eradicate evil. All the enemies of the Jews would have been eradicated at that point because the Jews fought back. And sometimes that happens, that we undergo really tough things to eradicate evil from our lives, from situations, from our church, from our nation. And even Haman's 10 sons were impaled on that pole at the end of the story. So I love this story. It's got a really nicely rounded, just quality. It ends really well, I think you'll agree. And all the sort of loose ends are tied up, which is nice. And there's a couple of challenges I just want to bring for us this morning. One of them I've alluded to already, just in that, what is God saying to us now? Where is our favor? What is this time? If you think for such a time as this, what does that mean to you? What is this time that you're in right now? We see that Esther clearly had favor. We see God working all through this story, working his deliverance, but she used her favor to get justice. She used it to speak to the king. And it's an important principle, just not to just follow our favor, but to work with our favor. I said that I felt personally challenged about being passive. When we have such a good God, it's very easy, isn't it, to just let go and let God and assume that he'll work things out. But actually, God orchestrated the amazing events in this story, but Esther still had a part to play. And her uncle said to her, look, you know, deliverance might rise up from somewhere else, but your family here and now will perish. They won't survive. So this was something that she had to do. I've been very struck as well by what Paul said in Philippians 1, where he's talking about, for me to live is Christ, to die is gain. And he's saying, if I die in this prison, that's better for me. I get to go to be with Christ, so that's better for me. But actually, it's better if I stay because I have work to do. And there's a clue there that really the work that he has to do, he's the one that wrote that God prepares works in advance for us to do, that God does prepare things for us. There are things that we should do. And we can't just abdicate responsibility for them. We had that word, didn't we, at the beginning of 2020 about the fulcrum moving, meaning that it would take much less effort to see greater results. And that's what God's favor looks like in a situation. So I'd ask you again, just where is your favor? What opportunities are available to you to see people saved, to see deliverance, to see justice done? I've been loving that song, God is So Good, where we sing that we're highly favored, anointed, and filled with his power for the glory of Jesus' name. I love that song, and that's how we need to see ourselves. As a team, we've been thinking about what autumn will look like. We're probably going to be in restrictions for quite a while, I guess, and we don't want to be passive. We want to keep dreaming, keep seeing what God is saying to us and what he'd have us do. And one of the things we've been thinking about a lot is about building community. Ginny had that word for us as a church about community within a community, and I think we're starting to see that. Many people will have found this situation so tough emotionally, financially, relationally, and we need to start thinking, where are we going to fit to serve our community now? Not when it's all gone away, but right now, how are we going to be working with the favor that God is giving us? And secondly, for those of us that are in a tough time and really struggling, I know this is a great story. God comes through in dramatic fashion, deliverance against seemingly impossible odds. And it's always good to look at stories like that. But one thing that I noted as I read through was that the date that the lots were cast was the 13th day of the first month. Now, we're told from Leviticus that the Passover is the 14th day of the first month. So these lots were cast literally on the night before Passover, which I believe is significant. I just think that if you're wondering whether God can and will come through for you, what better story to think about than God's miraculous deliverance of his people through the Red Sea years before? And that's another really great principle for us when we're facing tough times. Just remind yourself of God and how faithful he is and what he's done before. Surround yourself with stories, testimonies, and see him do it again. The other thing that I was thinking about these stories, and the same with this Esther story, if we've heard it before, then we'll know the ending, and we tend to skip through fairly upbeat, not really seeing the highs and the lows, but just knowing that it all works out. And I think often our stories are like that, aren't they? I've shared many stories about needing a job and one just falling into my lap, or, all kinds of things where we kind of share the story, we telescope down all the details, and then it all works out. And it's great. And I think it's very easy to see the hand of God and God working in our lives in hindsight when we're through and on the other side. But it can be really, really tough to see God working in the middle of our difficulties. And Sashi talked earlier about the wilderness, and I think that was a brilliant word about how we see God working in the middle of things sometimes. That's our Waymaker says, even when I don't see it, you're working. When I don't feel it, you're moving. And I love that too. And I just want to commend some of the people we've had on Thought for the Day, people like the Brydens and the Stroutons and many others have shared where they're at in their story right now when it's really, really tough. And I just think that takes such courage to do that. And, sometimes we cannot really be sure how God's going to come through when we're in the middle of it. And I just want to encourage us really as we do community together to reach out to each other and learn to walk through these stories and share them, not just when we're through the other side and praise God, he brings us through, but when we're in it and we're really not sure sometimes, to do community, to be authentic together and to share with each other and learn how to walk that through. So as we said earlier, if you want to respond to anything that I've said, if you would like prayer, I think Dan will tell you now how you can go about that. And it's been great just spending some time with you. Thank you.